court back to order. We are in session again on the trial of United States versus DuPont. We were going to turn to the defense case, but I understand a time check is appropriate at this point. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor, we have checked our time remaining with the bailiff.
We have as well, Your Honor.
Anyone mind enlightening me?
I don't want to misquote the time, so.
Your Honor, the prosecution has 34 minutes and 3 seconds.
The defense has 28 minutes and 34 seconds.
And then Ms. Burrell?
Your Honor, at this time, the defense does have a motion to raise with the court. We would raise a Rule 29 motion for a judgment of acquittal at this time.
Go ahead with your argument.
Now, this evidence does have to be viewed in light most favorable to the non-moving party, in this case, the prosecution. However, no reasonable juror could find Mr. DuPont guilty of either of the charges at this time. The prosecution has not brought any physical evidence of blood or of a crime scene where they suspect that Mr. Sanchez was killed. They've brought no evidence of his body being moved in any kind of vehicle to the location where it was dumped. And because of that, no reasonable juror could find him guilty of first-degree murder. And moving to the second charge, Your Honor, the destruction or alteration of evidence, the prosecution must prove that Mr. DuPont destroyed or concealed an object, in this case, his Winchester hunting rifle. And we have heard no evidence today of any destruction or concealment. All we've heard evidence of today is that nobody looked for that weapon. And so no reasonable juror could find Mr. DuPont guilty of that charge.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Government response?
Your Honor, when viewing the facts in most favorable to the non-moving party, which is the government, under Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure 29A, the government must meet the burden of a prima facie case, which has been established for murder in the first degree as well as destruction of evidence. Now, in regards to murder in the first degree, and before I go into this argument, I'd like to direct Your Honor's attention to page 136 of the record. The jury instructions would specifically cite circumstantial evidence that is to be considered in the same weight as direct evidence. We've heard testimony today from Special Agent Bryce Cameron Riggs of the FBI. Agent Riggs testified that during her investigation, she discovered numerous inconsistencies with the defendant's statements about the night that Mr. Sanchez was murdered, as well as discovering 3 possible motives limited to the defendant's business, his marriage, and his pride that would give the defendant reason to kill the victim in this matter, as well as hearing the statements about how they had been fighting, how that had been an issue for financial reasons. In addition, Agent Riggs testified to Mr. Sanchez suffering 2 gunshot wounds. One wound was shown to have fragments within the body, and another bullet was discovered just outside the defendant's property, a bullet covered in blood with the defendant's fingerprint on it. Agent Riggs testified that both these bullets were .30 caliber, the same caliber found within Mr. Sanchez. Now, taking the light the circumstantial evidence of the motive, the evidence found, as well as Agent Riggs' testimony as lead investigator in this case, we've made a prima facie showing for murder in the first degree. As for the destruction of evidence charge, we have heard from Agent Riggs in her testimony that as someone who is trained in deception detection, she identified that during her interview with the defendant, he was inconsistent in his statements to Agent Riggs regarding that gun. She had testified that there had been numerous inconsistencies about this same object, and the fact that she had executed 3 lawfully executed search warrants and still could not find this weapon would show that the defendant interfered with a federal investigation as Agent Riggs was acting on behalf of the FBI. Taking with all the circumstantial evidence that the bullets were only 3 serial numbers apart, the government has established a prima facie showing for murder in the first degree and destruction of evidence, and respectfully urges you to deny opposing counsel's motion.
Last word?
Yes, Your Honor. Regarding the destruction of evidence charge, what Mr. Coven said was inconsistencies was a single interview conducted by the FBI in which at the beginning of the interview, Mr. DuPont said one thing, and by the end of the interview, he had corrected himself. That inconsistency alone in one sit-down with the FBI is not enough to relieve them of their burden to do due diligence and look for the weapon that they believe was destroyed. And we know that it was never looked for in Wyoming, and so there is no reasonable juror that could find that he destroyed that gun based on that alone.
Thank you, counsel. The motion under Rule 29 is denied.
And Your Honor, the defense calls Harper Williams into the stand. morning, Ms. Williamson. Can you introduce yourself to the court and spell your last name for the record?
I'm Harper Williamson, Williamson.
How old are you, Ms. Williamson?
I'm 33 years old.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a personal trainer.
How are you connected to today's case against Mr. DuPont?
I know Charlie because he's a member of my gym.
Is that how you first met Mr. DuPont?
Yes.
And when was that you two first met?
I met him about 13 months from last summer, so maybe
That's okay. What is the relationship that you have with Mr. DuPont?
one is personal training.
Anything else?
Yeah, we meet outside of the gym as well.
What do you do when you meet outside of the gym?
We spend a lot of time together romantically, going on dates and things like
So is Mr. DuPont your boyfriend, Ms. Williamson?
that. Yes,
I want to talk more about that relationship. Now, beyond seeing Mr. DuPont for romantic gatherings outside of the gym, do you rely on him in other ways?
Yeah, he pays for all of our activities.
What kind of things does he pay for specifically, Ms. Williamson?
Dinners, sometimes my car payment, and then
How many times has he paid your car and rent bills?
for months.
What would you have done to pay those bills off if Charlie DuPont hadn't stepped in?
I would have to probably go back to my old job.
Which was what?
I was a stripper.
Did you have any plans on going back to that old job?
No, I really wanted to put that part of my life behind me.
Ms. Williamson, did you and Mr. DuPont ever talk about the DuPont family vineyard?
We talked about it a little bit, yeah, he confided in me about his business.
Did you know when Mr. DuPont hired Ignacio Sanchez?
Yeah, I knew that he was bringing him from Chile.
I want to talk about some of the communications that you had with Mr. Sanchez before he was found murdered. Permission to approach the witness, Your Honor, was what's been previously entered as Exhibit 40.
Which one is that one?
Your Honor, that is page 127, and it's a two-page exhibit. Ms. Williamson, do you recognize the emails I've just shown you?
I do.
Your Honor, permission to publish Exhibit 40 to the jury. Ms. Williamson, this first email here, the one you've got on your left, who sent that?
Ignacio sent it.
Who did he send it to?
He sent it to myself and Charlie.
Can you read the first two sentences of that email?
Yeah. It says, look, Charlie, I know you were running around on your own. You are not real good at hiding your whole secrets.
Can you read the last paragraph of that email for the jury?
Yes. Honor your employees' overtime hours and get your guys proper gear they need in order to do their job safely. Or I will tell everyone about your little affair with Harper. Yeah, I know about Harper, and I can shut that down real quick.
When you received this email, did you say anything back to Mr. Sanchez?
I sure did.
Ms. Williamson, who sent this email?
I
Who did you send it to?
sent it to Ignacio.
Can you read the email, including the subject line for the jury?
Yes, the subject line is dirty little secret, what now? And I replied, that little Ignacio thinks he could just go around threats like that at us, at me. Charlie, baby, if you don't put him into this ASAP, I will. That's what I said.
I want to talk about the one time you were interviewed by the FBI during their investigation into this murder. When was that you sat down with Agent Riggs?
I believe it was in August 2008.
Does maybe June sound about right?
June is correct.
That's okay, Ms. Williamson. So when you sat down with Agent Riggs in June, did he ask you what you were doing on the night in question?
Yeah, he asked me what I was doing.
And what was your story then?
I told him that I went to a Brazilian steakhouse with Charlie,
What did you tell him you did after that?
that I went straight home.
Did you ever change that story, Ms. Williamson?
Yes, I later changed.
And what was it that you were actually doing on the night of June 4th?
Charlie and I went to the hotel.
How long were you at that hotel for?
Approximately an hour, 2 hours,
Do you know what time you left that hotel that night?
around 2 a.m.
After you changed your story about your whereabouts that night, did anyone from the FBI interview you a second time?
No.
Did anyone even call you? after you left that motel at 2 a.m. and you went home, did anyone see you?
No.
Did you make any phone calls to anyone or speak to anyone on the phone after 2 a.m. that night?
No, it was pretty late, so I didn't make any phone calls.
Throughout this investigation into your boyfriend, Charlie DuPont, did anyone ever ask you to take your fingerprints?
No.
Was your vehicle ever searched?
No.
Were your phone records ever given up by your provider?
No.
During this investigation, did you ever feel like you had been made a suspect?
No, I never felt like
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor, if I may inquire, permission to use opposing counsel's PowerPoint that they published in the jury?
Does the defense have any objection to using the power?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. Your Honor, may I inquire? Good morning, Ms. Winston. Now, you were having an affair with the defendant, Charlie DuPont.
yes,
Behind the back of his wife, behind the back of his children.
yes,
And at one point in time, you and Mr. DuPont were the only individuals who knew about this affair.
yeah, we wanted to keep it
Right, you wanted to keep it a secret, but at some point in May of 2019, someone else knew about this affair.
secret.
And that person was Ignacio Hernandez Sanchez. And you were aware of this because Mr. Sanchez sent both you and the defendant an email. And in that email, Mr. Sanchez expressed that he would expose your affair to everyone.
Yes, he did.
Now, you testified on direct examination that you responded to Mr. Sanchez with that email, correct?
Yes.
Permission to publish was previously published on direct examination as government defense forwarding. All right, thank you. Now, you testified that this was you sending this email to Ignacio Hernandez Sanchez, isn't that correct?
I believe I sent it to Charlie and
You sent it to Charlie and Ignacio, but on the to line, doesn't that say me?
yes.
And isn't me indicated by this email as Charlie DuPont? So just to be clear, you didn't send this email to Mr. Sanchez. You said the words, that little Ignacio punk thinks he can just throw around threats like that. Charlie, baby, if you don't put an end to this ASAP, that was Charlie DuPont, not Ignacio Sanchez. Now, I want to talk to you about your interview and some of the statements that you provided in this case. Now, like you testified on direct examination, you were interviewed by Agent Briggs on June 27, 2019. And you asked some questions, and you provided some answers. Now, particularly, you were asked about what time you got to the steakhouse that night.
Yes, it
And you told Agent Briggs first that you got there at 8 p.m. But then, on August 12, 2019, you actually wrote a letter, didn't you?
was. Yes, it was.
You wrote a letter that the defense actually asked you to write.
Not necessarily.
Is it your testimony here today that the defense did not ask you to write this letter?
I spoke with Charlie's attorneys, but I don't think they asked.
Would it possibly refresh your recollection if I were able to show you a document that would indicate such? For court opposing counsel, I'm referring to the affidavit by Harper Jean Williamson, which can be marked for identification purposes as 1 moment, Your Honor. Which has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit 7. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Does counsel have a copy of the 7 in front of you?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Go ahead, approach the witness.
There you go, Ms. Williamson. Now, if I could just direct your attention to the second paragraph, you could just read that to yourself and just look up at me whenever you do. Your Honor, may I reapproach? Now, Ms. Williamson, has your memory now been refreshed?
Yes, I remember.
So, you were asked on behalf of opposing counsel to write a letter.
Yes, it is.
A letter on behalf of the defendant. And in that letter, you changed that time of 8 p.m. when you got to the steakhouse to 9 p.m.
Yeah, 9 p.m. was more accurate.
Just to be clear, that was only after you were asked to write that statement.
Yes.
And in that same interview on June 27, 2019, you were asked about what time you ended up leaving the steakhouse.
Yes.
Now, at first you said you left the steakhouse at 10 p.m.
Yes, I did.
But then at the end of your interview, you said maybe it was later than 10.
Yeah, we got there at 9, so we left a little bit.
But in that interview, on June 27, 2019, you told Agent Riggs after the steakhouse, you went straight home.
I did say that, yes.
You didn't go anywhere else
I said that originally, yes.
originally. But once again, on August 12, 2019, you changed your story, correct?
Yes, our affair wasn't necessarily known then, so I changed the statement. I felt more comfortable letting everyone know about the affair.
So you didn't tell Agent Riggs that, right? Now, in that affidavit that you were asked to write by opposing counsel, you said that you actually went to a Motel 6.
Yes,
And you said both of you took separate vehicles there. You drove yours,
I did.
the defendant drove his. And nowhere in your interview at all on June 27th did you mention any of this.
No, I did not.
Now, I want to talk to you about the Motel 6 for a moment. Like you said, you drove separately to the Motel 6, and you personally, you drive a white Toyota 4Runner, correct?
Yes.
You're on permission to have the bailiff pull up what has been previously entered into evidence as Governance 26?
Go ahead.
I'll step out of the way. Permission to have the lights just dim a little. Now, Ms. Williamson, what we're looking at here, that truck right there, that's your white Toyota 4Runner, right?
Yes,
And this is parked outside the Motel 6,
yes,
the same Motel 6 that you said you went to.
yes, it is.
But next to you, even you were, by looking at this picture, you could tell there are about maybe 8 different parking spaces.
Yes, sir.
Yet, nowhere in this parking space do you see Mr. DuPont's car.
Yes, he parked around the corner.
So you can see his truck in this picture?
No.
Okay. So, you're familiar with this truck, right?
Yes,
You've seen it multiple times?
yes,
So you would agree, nowhere in this camera is this truck.
that's correct.
And you would agree that this time of this picture was at 12:07 a.m.,
Yes, that's correct. He parked around the corner.
where he didn't want to be seen.
Yes.
Take it down. Thank you. Now, Ms. Williamson, I want to talk to you about some of the statements that you made where you admitted that you weren't actually with the defendant in this case. You said that first, when you arrived at the steakhouse and the defendant showed up, you weren't with him prior to that.
Yeah, he met me in the car.
And when you took separate vehicles to go to the Motel 6, once again, you weren't with him.
Yes, that's correct.
And actually, when the defendant got to the steakhouse, or got to the Motel 6, I'm sorry, he left immediately for 25 to 30 minutes.
He went to go get his bottle of wine.
You weren't with him.
No, it was not.
Ms. Williamson, you testified on direct examination that prior to meeting Mr. DuPont, you were a servant.
Yes.
And you admitted that there's a lot of things that the defendant does for you.
Yeah, he takes care of me.
That takes care of your face, your dinners,
Yes,
shopping sprees.
yes,
Shopping sprees in Nordstrom.
yeah,
He also pays your car payment,
yes,
your rent.
yes.
And if he stopped doing those things, you have to go back to stripping.
Yeah.
No further questions.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead, Ms. Brown.
Ms. Williamson, before you wrote that affidavit, did myself or Ms. Hersey ask you to make up a lie?
No, they're not.
So why did you write what you did in that affidavit in August?
Because I felt the need to come out and tell the truth.
And directing your attention to when you were at the Motel 6 with Charlie that night, when he left for a bottle of wine, did you have a bottle with you in the room already?
No, we did not.
When he came back, did he have one?
Yes.
A moment to confirm, Your Honor. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Is this witness excused?
They are, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Williamson, for your time and testimony.
Thank you.
Does the defense have another witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Charlie DuPont. Good morning, Mr. DuPont. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name for the record?
Sure, my name is Charlie DuPont, that's D-U-P-O-N-T.
Now, Mr. DuPont, I want to start by talking a little bit about your background and let the jury get to know you. So where do you live?
Right here in Napa Valley.
And how long have you lived in Napa Valley?
My entire life, born and raised.
What do you do for a living?
I'm the proud owner of my own vineyard, the DuPont Family Winery, and I started that about 17 years ago.
So as the owner of your own winery, what sorts of job responsibilities do you have?
Well, I oversee all the daily operations, so everything from the vines to actually bottling the wines, the sales, keeping track of our profits, everything that would go into operating a business.
And how has business been for you?
We've had our tough times. It's been a struggle, just with the weather conditions, weather patterns being the way they are. Global warming is a thing, and then competition's always tough. So it's been hard.
So how have you responded to global warming and these challenges?
Well, we did some outside reinforcements. So we actually went all the way to Chile to sponsor a visa for Ignacio Sanchez, who's an expert who's going to turn our business around.
Now, Mr. DuPont, I want to turn and talk about Mr. Sanchez's role at the winery. Why did you think Mr. Sanchez would help your business?
Well, he had this new method of vine vine cultivation that makes these vines more weather resistant. So it was a solution to all the problems that we've been having, and we looked everywhere, and he was our guy. He was going to be our savior.
So how crucial was Ignacio Sanchez to the success of your business?
He was our only hope at that point, and he was absolutely vital to our success.
Now, what was your personal relationship like with Mr. Sanchez?
We had our ups and downs, for sure. At first things were okay, and then he started to have some complaints. He's a little more outspoken than some of my other employees, so that caused a little bit of tension.
What sorts of things would he complain about?
He would complain about things like wages for the other employees, things like subsidizing safety equipment, those sort of worker-related complaints.
So did your conversations with him about these complaints ever get heated?
At one point it did, actually. On June 4th, he actually confronted me in person for the first time about it, and we kind of got in each other's face, and it was like a macho moment, but and then I actually did get a little physical. He did punch me in the face, but then I guess that's what it took for us to realize that we were just being irrational and macho, I guess, about it, and we actually sat down and talked about it afterward, and we resolved all of our issues.
Let's back up for just a second, Mr. DuPont. How did you react after getting punched in the face by Mr. Sanchez?
Well, of course I was shocked, as to be understood. I mean, it's my employee, punching me in the face, but it made me realize a couple things, and it made me realize that we needed, this was really important to him, and I need to actually have a professional conversation to actually try and resolve some of these issues.
So what was your conversation where you resolved these issues?
Well, we had a conversation that day in my office, again, actually professional this time, and we resolved our issues. I agreed to actually increase the wages and to subsidize the equipment, so it would be paid for out of the business's pocket.
Now, Mr. DuPont, I want to turn and walk through your night on the evening of June 4th. What time did you leave work that evening?
I stayed at work late that evening, actually implementing some of the things that we discussed, as well as new expansion projects. So I was actually there until about 9:30.
And after you left work, where'd you go next?
I went to a Brazilian steakhouse for dinner.
Who'd you go to dinner with?
I went with Harper Williamson, who I've been seeing for some time.
Now, is that the story that you initially told the police?
No, it's not. I initially told the law enforcement, well, I did tell them where I went, and that was true. I told them that I went with a friend named Eric and not Harper.
Why weren't you fully forthcoming with the police initially?
The affair is not something I'm proud of. Looking back, I definitely should have been more forthcoming. about who I was with and giving law enforcement all the information. At that time, the affair was just something I was not really proud of.
Now, after dinner, where'd you go next?
After dinner, we went to a Motel 6, that's kind of a meetup point for us. So that's, we went there around 11 o'clock or so.
How late did you stay at the motel?
Till about 2 in the morning.
And when you left the motel, did you leave separately or did Harper come with you?
We drove separately the entire night. I met at the restaurant in my own car, and we drove to the hotel separately, and then we left the hotel separately.
And where'd you go after the hotel?
I went home.
When was the next time you spoke with Harper Williamson?
Not for about a week afterwards.
And Mr. DuPont, when did you learn that Mr. Sanchez had been killed?
I'll never forget receiving that call. It was the next morning. I found out while I was at work. It was devastating.
So what has it been like at the winery after losing Mr. Sanchez?
It's been absolutely horrible. I mean, it's not only did we lose one of the most important people for our business and keeping my 17-year in the running operation alive, but the morale is low. I mean, he meant a lot to all of us, and we lost a friend and an important asset to the business. It's going to be absolutely horrible.
Mr. DuPont, you've been present throughout the trial today, and you heard Blair Pickus and Agent Riggs testify.
I have.
I want to turn and talk a little bit about some of the things that they brought up today. So did you hear Blair Pickus talk about the phone calls you made that evening?
I did.
And do you remember placing and receiving those phone calls?
Yes, I remember placing a call to my brother at 11:45-ish that night. And then I vaguely remember receiving a couple calls. They were telemarketers. I was enjoying time with Harper. I remember being annoyed by them.
Do you remember where Blair Pickus said your phone calls placed you that evening?
I mean, right around where I was, right around that motel.
Your Honor, at this time I'm republishing what's been previously entered as Exhibit 33. Now, Mr. DuPont, could you point out just again where that motel, just vaguely to the jury, where the motel is on this map?
Sure, it's actually right above Shelbyville and next to Teleman.
And remind the jury again, how long were you at that motel?
For 3 hours, which was the time that those 3 phone calls would have placed me right there.
I also want to turn and talk about your gun that we've heard about today. What is the gun that you own, Mr. DuPont?
I own and I have owned for a while now a Winchester 1895 30-30 rifle. I'm an avid hunter. I haven't been able to hunt much lately, just how busy we've been, but I own a Winchester.
And where is this gun, Mr. DuPont?
It's at Sam Zadis' cabin up in Jackson, Wyoming.
Now, when you spoke with Agent Riggs initially, is this what you told him?
Yes, that's exactly what I told him, that it's at Jackson, Wyoming at Sam Zadis' cabin. It hasn't left. And
to your knowledge, if the government had ever gone and looked for that gun, would it have been at Sam's cabin?
Yes, and they can still go there. It's still there.
And if they had gotten it and tested it for ballistics, what do you think it would have shown?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Mr. DuPont, did you kill Ignacio Sanchez?
I absolutely did not, could not, and would never kill the single person that was going to save our business. It's been horrible since he's been dead for everyone, and for me especially.
Thank you, Mr. DuPont. No further questions.
What cross-examination?
For your honor, it's actually pronounced COVID.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I get it all the time. Your honor, may I inquire?
Go ahead, Mr. Cohen.
Good morning, Mr. DuPont. Good morning. I want to talk to you a little bit about your relationship with the victim, Mr. Sanchez. Mr. Sanchez was pressuring you to pay your workers' warrant.
He did.
And that's not necessarily something you could afford to do.
No, I mean, we were already overextended, as I said, times were tough.
Right, you were overextended because you were in the middle of a huge expansion.
We were trying to expand while also navigating how the weather conditions have been affecting us and our competition.
Right, and because you couldn't raise wages, Mr. Sanchez actually threatened you with lawsuits.
Yeah, he threatened to bring the ACLU.
Right, he threatened the ACLU to bring that in against you.
He did.
You've in fact said unions such as those are bad for business.
Yes.
And he was even threatening to get your workers up in arms, ready to protest.
Yeah, he was talking about trying to lead some protests. Yeah, it wasn't something that I wanted them to be really focusing on. I wanted them to focus on the work at hand. We had a big job to do, especially in light of how overextended our business was.
Right, especially while you're overextended, you need your workers for your business.
Yes, of course.
And this wasn't the first time you and Mr. Sanchez had argued about these conditions.
What are you referring
His threats about the ACLU as well as lawsuits.
to? Right,
They weren't the first time you argued about those conditions.
right.
In fact, on June 4th, you had 2 arguments with the victim about these same conditions.
Right.
So let's start with the first one. That took place at 2:30,
Sounds right.
was out in your vineyard fields.
Yes, it was.
You and Mr. Sanchez argued about those same conditions.
We did.
And Mr. Sanchez punched you twice.
I don't remember how many times he punched me. I think he just punched me once.
So he punched you.
He did.
And on direct examination, you said later in the day you had a professional conversation with Mr. Sanchez.
He did.
That conversation was at 6 o'clock.
That sounds about right. Yeah, we had a conversation in my office.
Well, you actually told Agent Riggs that was an argument.
Yeah, I see it as a conversation, but
You considered an argument a conversation?
if that's what I told Agent Riggs, I guess, at that time, then it could have been.
In fact, you were shouting.
I don't remember shouting, but
Is it your testimony you don't remember that there was shouting in that conversation?
not at that one, in the office, but I know we resolved our issues.
Would it help if I refresh your recollection?
As to what I told Agent Riggs?
Yeah, as to your statements about shouting.
Probably, yeah, actually.
Your Honor, let the record reflect I am showing opposing counsel, page 138 of the record. Mr. DuPont, I'm handing you your previous interview with Agent Riggs. I'm going to go ahead and direct you to these 2 months. Just hold that, read that to yourself, and look up at me when you're done.